A rifle cracked the morning open before the sun even cleared the ridge. The sound didn't just echo out there, it slapped the rocks and kicked dust off the ground like the desert itself had flinched. Don Silvano froze mid-step, and Sarah Leighton did what hungry, tired people learn to do fast in the Southwest. She tightened her grip on the one thing keeping her alive. The water barrel sat 3 steps behind them, and 3 mounted men were coming in, slow and confident, rifles riding easy across their saddles. I'm your host from Savage West Stories, and if you're here with me, close enough to feel the heat of this fire, then you already know how it works out on those old trails. You can walk for days and meet nobody at all. Then, in one bad minute, you meet the kind of men who think your thirst belongs to them. The riders came closer, hooves dull in the sand, horses sweating like they'd been pushed hard. The lead man didn't look excited. That was the first warning sign. Calm is what you get when a man thinks he already owns the ending. Don Silvano's right hand drifted toward his belt. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to say, I'm awake and I'm not helpless. "Morning," the lead rider called, voice almost friendly. "Morning," Silvano answered. The rider's eyes moved past him, straight to the barrel. He looked at it the way a starving dog looks at a bone it didn't earn but plans to take anyway. "Long walk to the next spring. You folks look heavy with water." Silvano didn't puff up. He didn't lie. He just said, "We paid for it." The rider smiled like that was adorable. "Out here, you don't pay for water. You take it or you die without it." Sarah kept her left hand inside her coat, fingers closed around a small deerskin pouch. It was the only soft thing she still owned. Inside were dried herbs and spices her mother had mixed years ago, back when kitchens were warm places and people still believed tomorrow was promised. Sarah didn't have jewelry. She didn't have a Bible. She had that pouch, and she had a black cast-iron skillet hanging off her pack like a chunk of night. That skillet wasn't romance. It was weight. It was meals. And if a stranger stepped too close, it could be something else, too. The rider's gaze slid to the skillet, and his expression tightened just a little. Men like him didn't like seeing that you had options. He nodded once toward the barrel. "Roll it over." Silvano's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "We're heading to San Tomas," he said. "There's a boy there with fever. Water's for him, too." The rider didn't blink. "Roll it over." Now think about that for a second. Sarah and Silvano weren't saints. They weren't out here trying to fix the territory. They were trying to reach a little settlement before the heat got worse and the wind turned mean again. They were tired, dry inside, and they'd already made too many decisions like this in their lives: share and weaken, or keep and harden. Sarah took one slow breath, and then she stepped forward, surprising even Silvano. "Sir," Sarah said, voice rough but steady, "you want water, you can have water, but you don't take the barrel." The lead rider looked amused. "And why's that?" "Because if you take it, we don't reach town, and then you've got 2 more dead people on your conscience." One of the men behind him laughed. The lead rider didn't. He watched Sarah like he was deciding whether she was stupid or dangerous. "You got a name, girl?" "Sarah." He nodded like he was filing it away for later. "All right, Sarah, here's how it works. You roll the barrel over, or we start shooting and see what luck finds." Sarah's eyes flicked to the rifle, then to the land around them. No trees, no cover, just open wash and sharp rock and a sun climbing fast. She could feel Silvano beside her, still as a fence post. Then Sarah made a choice. Not heroic, practical. "Give me 2 minutes," Sarah said. The rider squinted. "For what?" "For a fire, for coffee, for a mouthful of something that makes you feel human again. Then you can drink, and we walk away with what we need." The rider shifted. Men like that hated delays, but they loved comfort, and coffee out here wasn't just a drink, it was a pause in the cruelty. "Coffee," the lead rider repeated, tasting the word. Silvano made a small sound in his throat, half warning, half disbelief. Coffee meant water. Coffee meant giving up something precious to men who didn't deserve it. Sarah didn't look at him. If she did, she might stop. The lead rider finally said, "1 minute." Sarah nodded and moved to her pack. She pulled out the skillet and set it on a flat rock. The iron looked like it had lived through too many hard meals and too many long roads. People think cooking is soft work. Out here, it isn't. It's timing, it's fuel, it's smell traveling on the wind telling strangers where you are. Cooking is risk. Sarah built a small fire fast, dry splinters, a twist of cloth with a few greasy drops saved from an older meal. She struck a match, and the flame caught low, protected by her hands. Silvano leaned in close, mouth barely moving. "What are you doing?" Sarah whispered. "Buying time," she said. "For what?" Sarah kept her eyes on the flame. "For you to decide what kind of man you are when it matters." Silvano went quiet, like that landed somewhere deep. Sarah poured in just a little water. It hissed and steamed on the iron. Then she shook the last of her coffee grounds into it. The smell rose quick, dark and sharp, cutting through sun-warmed dust like a memory. Even the horses lifted their heads. The lead rider breathed it in, and for half a second his face looked younger. Then he hardened again, like he'd caught himself feeling something. "Smells good," he said. Sarah poured the thin coffee into a dented tin cup and held it out. The rider didn't take it right away. He watched her hands, watched Silvano, watched the cup like he expected poison or a trick. Then he took it, and he drank. While he did, Sarah watched the other two men. Their eyes kept sliding to the barrel. One of them licked cracked lips like he couldn't help it. That's the ugly truth. Thirst makes animals out of us. Not always evil animals, just simple ones. The rider handed the cup back. "All right," he said. "Water." Sarah stepped to the barrel, opened the bung, and poured water into the cup, carefully. Not full, not empty. Enough to prove she meant it, and not enough to kill herself later. The lead rider drank again, slower this time. Silvano still hadn't moved, but his hand had eased away from his belt. He was reading the room, counting heartbeats. Then the second rider leaned forward and spoke up. "Boss, we should take it anyway." The lead rider snapped a glare at him. "Shut up." And that told Sarah something important. The lead rider wanted control more than he wanted blood. He wanted to be the only wolf in the pack. Sarah offered the other two riders water as well, the same measured amount. They drank like they hated her for controlling it and like they respected her for it. When they finished, the lead rider wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "You two can keep your barrel," he said, like he was granting mercy. "But you walk fast. There's trouble in San Tomas." Silvano's face tightened. "What kind of trouble?" The rider's smile came back, thin and lazy. "The kind with papers and fences. The kind that makes people beg." He tipped his hat to Sarah, mock polite. "Good coffee." Then he rode off, hooves clapping on hard ground, dust lifting behind him like smoke. Sarah didn't let herself relax until the sound was gone. Only then did her shoulders drop. Silvano exhaled through his nose. "Coffee," he said. Not praise, not anger, just a man trying to understand what he'd just seen. Sarah hooked the skillet back onto her pack. "They weren't going to kill us," she said quietly. Silvano looked at her. "You don't know that." "I know thirst," Sarah answered, "and I know men who are scared. That one was scared of his own hunger, so I fed it a little." Silvano stared out at the empty land where the riders had vanished. "Trouble in town," he said. Sarah tightened the grip of the barrel rope. "Then we don't have time to waste." And with that, they started walking again, north, along a dry wash that twisted through the desert like a dead snake, towards whatever kind of trouble was waiting in San Tomas. Now, before we follow Sarah and Don Silvano the rest of the way, you need to know who they were before that rifle cracked the morning open. Because people don't just appear in the desert with a skillet, a water barrel, and a look in their eyes that says they've already buried too much. Sarah Leighton came from back east. She didn't talk about it much, and it wasn't because she wanted to sound mysterious. It's because the past doesn't put food in your stomach. Out there, memory is a luxury. Most days you can't afford it. She started as a kitchen girl in a boarding house, the kind of place that always smelled like boiled laundry and burnt coffee. Long hours, low pay, hands always raw from soap and heat. Then she took work cooking for a rail crew for a while. And if you've ever been around those camps, men working hard, living rough, you know what can happen when a foreman decides the rules don't apply to him. Sarah learned that female sometimes got translated as available, and the West didn't come with a manager to complain to. So she left. No big speech, no dramatic goodbye.
She took what she owned, a heavy cast-iron skillet, a blanket, a few matches, and a small deerskin pouch of spices her mother had put together years earlier, and she walked west until the land itself looked like it had forgotten what kindness was. Silvano was different, older, Mexican, or maybe mixed, depending on who's doing the talking. He had that kind of face you only earn by watching the horizon for decades. Deep lines, eyes that don't get surprised anymore, just disappointed. He'd worked as a vaquero when cattle outfits still treated the open range like it belonged to the sky. He'd ridden long drives north to railheads where money changed hands fast, and men lied even faster. And like most men who stayed in that work long enough, they'd buried friends in shallow ground with no marker but a stone. Silvano lived by one rule: don't attach your heart to anything you can lose in a single night. Sarah didn't know that rule when she met him. She learned it the hard way, the way most people do. They crossed paths at a broken-down place that used to be a stage stop. No name worth keeping now, just a roof leaning into the wind and a water trough full of green scum. Sarah was trying to boil that swamp water into something safer. She had her little fire low, her skillet balanced like a promise. And Silvano came up quiet like a coyote that isn't sure yet whether you're trouble or food. He stood there a moment, watching her work. Then Sarah opened that spice pouch, just a crack, enough for the smell to rise, and Silvano's expression changed, like he'd been punched gently in the chest by a memory he didn't expect to feel again. He said, "That's real food." Sarah snapped her eyes up, skillet in hand, ready to swing. "Out there, you don't wait to find out what a stranger wants." She said, "It's beans." Silvano shook his head. "It's memory. There's a difference." Now think about that for a second. In a world where everything gets stripped down to survival, water, calories, distance, this man still recognized the difference between fuel and comfort, between eating and being fed. He didn't ask for charity. He offered trade, a day of guidance for a meal. Sarah agreed because she was tired of walking blind, and because guidance in the desert is worth more than coins. That's how they became a pair. Not friends at first, more like two tools in the same box, useful together but still sharp around the edges. They headed toward a settlement called San Tomas because Silvano said there might be work there. Not good work, but real work, he warned. San Tomas sat down in the Rio Grande Valley country, the kind of place built around an acequia, an irrigation ditch system families shared, cleaned, and argued over. That system wasn't new. Spanish communities and Pueblo communities, too, had lived by water rules like that for generations. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival with structure. It was the closest thing to law a lot of people ever had. And by the late 19th century, that kind of old agreement was getting squeezed from every direction. Railroads had started cutting through the territory. Big outfits were fencing land with barbed wire like they were drawing lines on God's paper. Courts were far away, and the law depended heavily on who had money to keep it interested. Some men believed a deed was stronger than tradition. Other men believed a rifle was stronger than both. San Tomas sat right on that fault line. As Sarah and Silvano walked, the day turned bright and cruel. Heat came down like a weight. Their boots scuffed through sand and stone. A couple lizards darted away from their shadows, quick and nervous. Silvano pointed once towards a darker band on the horizon. "Cottonwoods," he said. "Water's near." Sarah felt her mouth water just hearing the word shade. And that's where part two leaves them. Still walking, still dry, still pushing forward, towards a town that depended on water like breath, and towards a kind of trouble that doesn't announce itself with gunshots at first. Sometimes it shows up as fences, paperwork, and a ditch that suddenly goes silent. By late morning, Sarah and Don Silvano started seeing the little warnings that tell you you're getting close to people again. Fence posts, sun-bleached and leaning. A broken wagon wheel half swallowed by sand like the trail had eaten it. A scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, snapping in the wind like it was trying to signal somebody who never came. Then they found the acequia. If you've spent any time in that Rio Grande country, you know those ditches are the town's pulse. Even in a dry season, you usually hear something. Water whispering, mud shifting, life moving where it's supposed to move. But this one was quiet. Quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. Sarah stepped up to the edge and looked down. Cracked mud, dry silt, no shine, no sound. Silvano's face tightened like someone had turned a key inside him. "They damned it," he said. Sarah didn't ask who at first, because out here the answer is almost always the same. Somebody with money, somebody with papers, somebody who decided mine mattered more than we. Still, she asked anyway. Who? Silvano wiped his brow under the hard sun. "A man who thinks he can buy the river," he said. They followed that dead ditch right into San Tomas. The town was small, the kind of place that survives more by stubbornness than by comfort. Adobe homes with flat roofs and chipped corners, a tiny chapel with a plain wooden door, a corral built from rough posts and patience, a store with a wooden front that sold flour, nails, and cheap whiskey, everything a place like that runs on when it's not running on water. Chickens scratched in the dust like they were searching for something better than dirt. A dog lay in the shade and watched without barking, too tired to waste energy on strangers. And people stood in their doorways, not welcoming, not threatening, just careful, watching Sarah's hands, Silvano's face, and that cast-iron skillet hanging off Sarah's pack like a dark warning. In the plaza, an older woman stepped forward. Her dress was plain, her hair was braided tight. Her eyes were sharp in a way that told you she'd already seen men like Sarah and Silvano come through with empty promises and full trouble. She looked at him, then at the barrel rope. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Are you with Pritchard?" Silvano's shoulders tensed so hard it looked like he'd been hit. "No," he said. Just that one word, but it landed heavy. Sarah kept her voice calm. "We're travelers." The older woman's gaze shifted to the skillet, then back to Sarah's face. "A woman walks with iron," she said quietly. "That means she has learned." Sarah didn't try to sound tough. She didn't try to charm anyone. She told the truth. "We're looking for work." The woman nodded towards the chapel. "The council meets," she said. "Go listen. If you're not with Pritchard, you should hear what he's done." Inside the chapel, the air was cooler, dimmer. Candles flickered along the walls, throwing soft, nervous light on rough benches. Men sat with their hats in their hands like the hats were the last bit of dignity they still owned. A younger man stood up, anger living in his shoulders. "They put up a new dam last week, upstream, on land they claim is theirs now. They say they have papers. They say the river is theirs to hold." Sarah listened, still and quiet. Silvano stayed near the wall, half in shadow, like he didn't want the room to remember him. An older man spoke next, slow and heavy, like he was lifting each word from deep inside. "We've used this water since my grandfather's time. We clean the acequia together. We share. Now our fields die." Then another voice, bitter and exhausted. "The sheriff says it's a civil matter. He says we should go to court in Santa Fe." And a short laugh moved through the room. Not humor, not relief, just that ugly laugh people make when they realize the rules were never written for them. Sarah understood that laugh right down to her bones. Go to court out here usually meant go away and starve quietly. The younger man slammed his fist into his palm. "We should break the dam tonight." A woman in the corner whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "And then they'll come with guns." That's when Silvano finally spoke. His voice was rough and low. "They will come anyway," he said. The room turned towards him all at once. Faces tightened, eyes narrowed. You could feel the suspicion rise like heat off stone. The younger man stared at him. "Who are you?" Silvano hesitated, just a heartbeat too long, and that hesitation told Sarah he had history here. "My name is Silvano," he said. "I used to ride for Pritchard's outfit." The chapel went stiff. Somebody spit on the floor. Sarah stepped forward fast, like she could physically block what was coming. "He's with me," she said, "and I'm not with anyone." The younger man's stare cut sharper. "Then how should we trust you?" Silvano didn't try to sell himself. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. "You shouldn't," he said. And that confused him, because it wasn't what liars say. It wasn't what men say when they're trying to climb onto your side for protection. It was the kind of answer that comes from somebody who's already paid for his choices. The older man studied Silvano's face like he was reading tracks in dirt. "If you rode for him," he said, "you know how he thinks." Silvano gave one small nod. "Yes." "Then tell us," the younger man demanded, "what happens when we have no crops?" Silvano's voice dropped even lower. "He'll offer to buy your land for nothing, and when you refuse, he'll wait, because he has water and you don't." That's the kind of silence you can hear. Candle wax dripping, breath being held, people realizing the fight wasn't just about a ditch, it was about time, about who could afford to outlast who. Sarah stood there with her skillet hanging heavy at her side, and she understood something simple and brutal. In places like San Tomas, the river wasn't just water, it was power, and somebody had decided to turn that power into a weapon.
The hoofbeats hit the plaza like a bad thought you can't shake. Fast, close, and when they stopped, the whole town seemed to stop with them. Inside the chapel, a boy came running in so hard he nearly tripped over his own feet. His eyes were wide, his chest heaving like he'd been sprinting for his life. "Riders," he gasped, "from the North Road." Silvano's head snapped up. "How many?" "4," the boy said, then corrected himself like he was still counting the sound in his head. "Maybe 5. Somebody muttered a curse under their breath, the kind of curse that isn't really aimed at God, it's aimed at fate. People moved at once, not screaming, not chaotic, it was a practiced motion, like they'd rehearsed fear before. Women gathered children close, men reached for rifles that looked older than the benches they were sitting on. Hands shook, but hands still worked. Then a voice outside carried through the chapel walls, loud enough to make even the candles feel smaller. "By order of the county, this water system is under protection of Mr. Harlan Pritchard's claim. Any interference will be met with force." Met with force. 2 words that meant the law wasn't coming to help. It meant the law was coming to stand behind whoever had money. Sarah felt the room tighten like a rope. She glanced at Silvano and saw his face go a shade paler, like he'd just recognized the shape of what was walking toward him. The chapel door swung open. Bright sunlight spilled across the floorboards, cutting through the dim like a knife. A man stepped inside without taking his hat off. That told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man he was. He wore a clean gun belt and polished boots, boots too shiny for someone who did real work. He looked around with a smile that didn't belong in a church. "I'm looking for troublemakers," he said, "and I hear you got one in here, Don Silvano." Every head turned. The air itself seemed to point. Sarah's throat went dry. She watched Silvano's shoulders, watched his hands. Silvano didn't move. The gunman's smile widened when he saw him. "There you are," he said. "Mr. Pritchard wondered if you were still breathing." His eyes slid to Sarah next. "And who's this?" Sarah didn't look away. "A cook." The gunman chuckled like she'd told him a joke. "A cook in San Tomas. That's funny. Folks here don't have enough water to boil beans." Sarah wanted to bring that skillet up right then and introduce him to iron. But violence is a bell you can't unring. Out here, once you ring it, it keeps ringing until somebody's dead. The gunman stepped closer to Silvano. "Pritchard says you stole from him," he said, "ran off with his horse and saddle." Silvano's jaw tightened. "I earned that horse." The gunman shrugged. "He says different." Then he leaned in, voice calm and ugly. "Come with us, Silvano. You can talk to Mr. Pritchard yourself. If you refuse, we'll assume you're here to help these folks cut his dam." That's when the younger man in the chapel lifted his rifle. His hands were shaking, but the barrel was aimed. The gunman turned his head slowly, still smiling. "You point that at me, and you die first." Now think about that for a second. That's how power works when law is far away. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be certain. Sarah stepped between them, not touching anyone, just placing her body in the line, the way you step between a match and dry grass. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice level, "this is a church." The gunman looked down at her like she was dirt that had learned to talk. "So?" Sarah swallowed. "If you want Silvano, you take him,
but you don't start shooting here." For a second, the gunman looked like he might do it anyway, just to prove he could do it. But he didn't want a mess. A mess wastes time, and time out here is money and control. He jerked his chin toward the door. "Outside, Silvano, now." Silvano glanced at Sarah. Quick, sharp, a question without words. "Do I run?" Sarah didn't answer because she didn't know. Running might save 'em for an hour. It might also get the whole town punished. Staying might get Silvano killed. There was no clean choice. Silvano took a step forward, and then something small happened that changed everything. The older woman from the plaza, the one with braided hair, reached out and touched Silvano's sleeve. Not begging, not pleading, just a touch. "If you go with them, you don't come back," she said softly. Silvano flinched like she'd hit him with truth. The gunman snapped, "Hands off." The woman lifted her chin. "This man has a mother, even if he forgot." You could feel the chapel hold its breath. The gunman's hand drafted toward his pistol, and Silvano moved. Fast, hard, real. He grabbed the gunman's wrist, twisted and shoved him back. No fancy moves, just a man deciding he wasn't going to be led away like a dog. The gunman stumbled in shock. The room exploded into motion. Shouts, benches scraping, someone crying out. Panic and courage mixing into the same ugly sound. Sarah's skillet was in her hands before she even knew she'd reached for it. The iron felt like a heartbeat, heavy, solid. Silvano barked one word, sharp as a whip. "Go!" He didn't mean run and abandon them. He meant move now or die here. Sarah grabbed her pack, clutched her spice pouch under a coat, and ran with Silvano through the back of the chapel into a narrow adobe alley. Behind them, gunshots cracked. Not a full battle, just enough to turn the air poisonous. Sarah's lungs burned. Dust filled her mouth. Silvano ran beside her with a slight limp, like an old injury woke up angry. They reached the edge of town where brush and mesquite began, and Silvano pointed toward a shallow arroyo cut into the earth. "Down," he said. They slid into it, crouched low and pressed into the dirt wall while hoofbeats thundered somewhere above. Men were shouting names, Silvano's name, like they could drag him back just by saying it. Sarah forced her breathing to quiet. Her hand shook once, then steadied on the skillet handle. Silvano wiped blood from his knuckles and stared at it like it had surprised him. "I didn't want that," he said. Sarah's voice came out thin. "Neither did they." Silvano's eyes went toward the town, hard. "He'll blame them for me," he said. "He'll punish them for me." Sarah felt something cold twist in her stomach because she believed him. "Then we can't just run," she said. Silvano let out a short, bitter laugh. "We can't fight him either." Sarah tightened the grip on the skillet. "You said you know how he thinks." Silvano nodded once. "Then we use that," Sarah said. Silvano looked at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't trust. "How?" Sarah stared back toward San Tomas, toward the chapel roof and the dry ditch and the people who'd just risked everything without even having enough water to boil beans. "He thinks people break," she said. "He thinks hunger makes you bow." Her hand moved to the spice pouch under her coat. "Maybe he's right," she continued, "but he forgets something." Silvano's eyes flicked to the pouch. "People remember," Sarah said, "and memory makes you stand when you should fall." Silvano held that for a moment, then gave a thin, grim look. "You want to cook at a gunfight." Sarah's mouth twitched almost a smile. "I want to cook before a gunfight. There's a difference." And in that dusty cut in the earth, with the town above them turning into a trap, Sarah and Silvano stopped being just two travelers. They became a problem.
They stayed down in that arroyo until the searching eased off. You could still hear hoofbeats now and then, far off, like thunder that didn't know where to land. Sarah kept one hand on her skillet the whole time, not because she wanted to fight, because out here, you don't get to choose what finds you. When evening finally softened the light, they moved, not straight back into San Tomas, not like people who didn't understand consequences. They circled in from the south, where the cottonwoods stood like tired guards along the low ground.
and that's where they found the town council again. This time not in the chapel, but packed into a back room behind the store. Rough plank walls, a hanging lantern throwing tired yellow light, sacks of flour and beans stacked like the town's last line of defense. The people in there looked at Silvano like he was a storm that had turned around and come back. A younger man sat with a rifle across his knees. His eyes never left Silvano. "You kill anyone?" he asked. Silvano shook his head. "No." "Did they follow?" an older man asked, voice low. "Not far," Silvano said. Sarah stepped forward because somebody had to say the thing everyone was afraid to say out loud. "They'll come again, and they'll come harder," she told him. Nobody argued. The silence in that room wasn't doubt, it was acceptance. The younger man leaned forward. "Then we cut the dam tonight." You could feel how good that idea sounded for about 2 seconds. Simple, clean, satisfying. Then reality crept back in. Silvano lifted a hand, palm open. "If you cut it and run," he said, "they'll build it again, and they'll burn houses to teach a lesson." The younger man's jaw tightened. "So what do we do? Beg?" Silvano looked down at his hands for a moment like he didn't enjoy being right about ugly things. "Pritchard isn't just a rancher. He's a buyer. He wants land. He wants control. He wants you to sign papers." Sarah listened, then asked the question that changed the air. "Does he ever come in person?" The room went quiet. Finally, an older woman, the one with the tight braids, spoke up. "He came once, a couple years back, offered money for the North Fields." "And?" Sarah asked. The woman's mouth pressed into a hard line. "My son threw the coins back at him," she said. Pritchard smiled, and he rode away. After that, the sheriff started visiting us more. Now think about that for a second. A smile can be a threat in the West. Sometimes it's the clearest one. Sarah took a breath. "Then we make him come again." The younger man stared like she'd lost her mind. "Why would he?" Sarah touched the deerskin pouch under her coat, then let it show in her hand. "This is what he doesn't have," she said. "Not spices, control." A woman asked, confused and nervous, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we invite him to a meal, a public meal, in the chapel yard, with everyone present." Somebody gave a sharp laugh, not because it was funny, because it sounded ridiculous in a town where people were counting cups of water. But Sarah didn't flinch. "A meal isn't magic," she said, "but it makes people gather. It makes witnesses, and witnesses make it harder to lie about what happened." Silvano watched her like he was seeing a tool he didn't know he had. Worry, yes, but respect, too. They argued the edges of it. What if Pritchard brought gunmen? What if he just grabbed Silvano and rode away? Silvano answered that one flatly. "If he takes me in front of everyone," he said, "he admits he's afraid of what I know. He won't like that." Sarah nodded. "He cares about his image, even out here in the dirt," she said. So they wrote a message, polite, careful, full of the kind of words men like Pritchard loved. Talk, settle, hear the offer. And they sent a boy north on a borrowed mule before the sun dropped. Then Sarah started cooking with whatever San Tomas could spare. Beans, flour, dried chili, onions, and a piece of salt pork that looked like it had been hidden for exactly this kind of day. She worked behind the store with Silvano building the fire. She toasted a pinch of spices from her pouch, just enough to wake the pot up, just enough to make the air change. And that smell, it didn't stay in the alley. It drifted into the street. It curled around adobe corners. It found people. Folks came closer, pretending they weren't. Children watched from a distance with wide eyes. Nobody smiled, but shoulders eased. Hunger can soften a town even when fear tries to keep it hard. Before night fully settled, the braided woman came by and set a small bundle of dried herbs on the table. "For strength," she said. No speech, no apology, just a quiet offering. Silvano watched that bundle like it was gold. Later, when the town finally went quiet, but not asleep, Sarah and Silvano sat near the back wall of the store with small bowls of beans. Lantern light made long shadows. Outside, the wind kept moving like it didn't care what humans were planning. Sarah asked softly, "What did you steal from him?" Silvano's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Sarah didn't push. She just waited. Silvano swallowed and said, "I didn't steal his horse. I stole his book." Sarah frowned. "Book?" "A ledger," Silvano said. "Names, payments, who he bribed, who he bought." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Why take that?" Silvano stared into his bowl like the answer lived in the beans. "Because he shot a boy, a ranch hand, young. He caught Pritchard diverting water from a neighbor's well. He argued. Pritchard shot him. Then he paid the sheriff to call it self-defense." The room felt colder, even with the lantern burning. Sarah asked, "And you kept the ledger because you thought it mattered?" Silvano nodded once. "I thought I could take it to a judge. Then I remembered where we are." Sarah studied him. "So why keep it now?" Silvano's jaw tightened. "Because even if it doesn't bring justice," he said, "it keeps me from forgetting." Sarah sat with that. Then she said quietly, "If Pritchard gets you, he gets that ledger." Silvano didn't deny it. "Yes." Sarah's hands clenched around her bowl. "Then he can't get you." Silvano let out a small, bitter breath. "You sound like someone who still believes you can choose." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "We are choosing, right now." By the next morning, San Tomas didn't feel like a town getting ready for a meeting. It felt like a town setting a trap and praying it wouldn't snap on their own fingers. Late morning sun baked the chapel yard, dust drifted in lazy sheets across the plaza, and people gathered in small, careful clusters, the way animals gather around a shrinking waterhole. Nobody laughed, nobody preached, they just watched the road. Sarah set her pots on a rough plank table and kept working like her hands could hold the world together. Beans, onions, chili, simple food, made as honest as she knew how. Steam rolled up into the heat, carrying a smell that didn't belong in fear. Silvano stood near the chapel wall with his hands visible, like he was making a promise without saying it. He had an old pistol tucked away, but it wasn't courage that kept him upright. It was the knowledge that if he ran now, this town would pay for it. The younger man had rifles hidden behind barrels and blankets, close enough to grab, far enough to pretend they weren't there. Nobody wanted a gunfight, but nobody wanted to kneel either. Then, right at noon, dust rose on the north road. You could feel the shift before you fully saw it. Work stopped, voices died, even the chickens seemed to go still. Riders came first, 5, then more behind them, and a wagon too, rolling slow like the man inside wanted to arrive with comfort and weight and proof that he had time to spare. Harlan Pritchard rode in the center, clean-shaven, pale skin burned red by sun, gloves on his hands like the dirt was contagious. He dismounted carefully, the way men do when they believe the ground belongs to them. He looked over the crowd and smiled like he was stepping onto a stage built for him. Then his eyes found Silvano. "Well," Pritchard called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't my runaway." Silvano didn't flinch. "Mr. Pritchard." Pritchard's gaze slid to Sarah and the steaming pots. "And you must be the cook." Sarah met his eyes and didn't drop them. "Yes, sir." He leaned in slightly, breathing in the smell. "Better than I expected," he said, like he was reviewing a tool he might buy. Sarah answered plain, "Food is food." Pritchard chuckled. "That's a poor woman's philosophy." Then he turned to the crowd, voice smooth and patient. "So," he said, "you're ready to accept my offer?" An older man from the council stepped forward, hands open. His voice shook, but it held. "We're ready to talk. We want the water running while we talk." Pritchard didn't even pretend. He just said, "No." That one word hit like a door slamming. Anger flickered across faces, but fear kept feet planted. Pritchard raised a gloved hand as if calming children. "I can have money, or you can have pride. Pride won't water your fields." Sarah watched him closely, not like a girl staring at a powerful man, like a cook watching how heat changes meat, patient, measuring, learning what's underneath. Silvano spoke, quiet but clear. "You damned water that isn't yours." Pritchard's eyes went cold. He said, "I own the land. I own what crosses it." A younger man snapped from the crowd, "The river is not a fence." Pritchard didn't spare him a glance. He kept his attention on Silvano. "You took my property," he said. "You return it, and then we'll discuss how kind I feel." Silvano didn't answer. Pritchard's smile turned thin. "Or I take you now in front of everyone, and I teach this town what happens when it shelters thieves." The air tightened. It was that quiet moment when everyone starts doing the same math. How many guns? How many bodies? Who falls first? And that's when Sarah did something small that changed the shape of the moment. She filled the tin cup from the pot and walked around the table. No shaking, no drama, just steady steps on dusty ground. She held the cup out to Pritchard. "Eat," she said. Pritchard blinked, genuinely surprised. "What?" "You came to be seen as reasonable," Sarah said. "So be reasonable. Eat in front of 'em, then talk." You could hear nothing but the steam and the wind. Pritchard stared at her a long moment, then smiled again, slow, warning. "You're bold," he said. "Bold cooks don't last long." Sarah didn't move. Her arm stayed extended like it weighed nothing. Finally, Pritchard took the cup. He sipped, just a mouthful, and for half a second his face twitched at the spice, at warmth he didn't want to admit he could feel. He handed it back. "Fine," he said. Then his voice hardened. "Now, Silvano, the book." Sarah felt it in her gut. So he did know. Silvano said flatly, "I don't have it." Pritchard sighed like he was tired of dealing with children. Then he gave a small nod to one of his men. The gunman stepped forward, hauling the message boy by the arm. The same boy, bruised face, dust on his shirt, terror in his eyes. A sound moved through the crowd, mothers recognizing the shape of grief before it arrives. Pritchard leaned close to the boy, voice almost gentle. "Maybe the child knows where you hid it. Maybe he has it." Silvano's face didn't change, but his eyes did. "Let him go." Pritchard looked at Silvano like he was enjoying the leverage. "Give me the ledger," he said, "and I let the boy go. Now, I'm going to tell you something straight, sitting here with you by this fire. This is where people want a clean story, a brave speech, a heroic shot. Real life in the West was rarely that clean." Sarah stepped forward and lifted her empty hand. "Wait." Pritchard turned, annoyed. "What now?" Sarah kept her voice steady, even though her throat was dry as dust. "You want the book. You want the water. You want the land. You want them afraid." Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "Yes." "Then take me instead of the boy," Sarah said. The plaza sucked in a breath. Silvano snapped toward her, anger and fear flashing. "Sarah, no!" Pritchard looked her over, amused again. "Why would I want you?" "Because I can cook," Sarah said, "and men listen to who feeds them. If you want this town to bend, you don't need another corpse. You need their routines." Pritchard studied her like a man inspecting a new tool. He liked control, and Sarah was offering him control wrapped in usefulness. "You'd work for me," he said. "Yes," she answered, and you could hear the lie and how hard it was to say. Pritchard gestured, and the gunman shoved the boy forward. The boy ran into the crowd, straight into his mother's arms. Relief rippled through the town like wind through grass. Then Pritchard held out his gloved hand to Sarah. "Come." Silvano's voice cut across the yard like a whip. "No." Pritchard's gaze snapped back to him. "Stay out of this." Silvano's hand went into his shirt. He pulled out a small book, the ledger. Pritchard's face lit up with satisfaction. "There it is." Silvano held it up so everyone could see. "This?" he asked, loud. "This is what you want?" Then he threw it, not at Pritchard, not at a gunman. He threw it into the open chapel doorway, right into the candlelight.
For a heartbeat, it spun through the air like a dark bird. Then it hit near the candles. Paper caught fast. Flames climbed the pages. The crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a shout, not quite a gasp, more like a town realizing the last piece of proof was turned into smoke. Pritchard's mask fell off. Rage took his place. "You idiot," he snarled, hand dropping toward his pistol. Silvano's pistol came up at the same time. The first shot cracked, then another, then chaos. People screamed and dove. The food table lurched as bodies collided, pots spilling beans into the dust like wasted hope. Pritchard's men raised rifles. Sarah didn't think. She moved. She swung her skillet into a rifle barrel as it came up, iron ringing against iron. The shot went wild into the sky. Silvano fired again, not to kill, but to carve space. And then he grabbed Sarah's wrist. "Run!" They bolted through the crowd and dropped into the dry acequia like it was a trench, sprinting along that dead channel as bullets snapped behind them. Because now there was no talk left, only pursuit, only dust, only the long, hard fact that Pritchard would never forgive being challenged in public.
And that's the moment you heard at the beginning. Dawn in a dry wash, a shot crack in the air, riders closing in like they own the horizon. Because after San Tomas, there was no going back to quiet life. Pritchard wasn't the kind of man who let an insult sit in his mouth. He collected, he corrected, and if he couldn't get his ledger back, if the proof was ash, then he'd settle for something else. Silvano and Sarah slipped out of town under the cover of night with what little they could carry, a small water barrel, a sack of food light enough not to slow them, and the cold knowledge that the only hard evidence, those pages full of names and payments, was gone. Witnesses still existed, sure, but witnesses are fragile. Fear feeds on people, and Pritchard had money to keep fear well fed. They headed away from San Tomas toward anywhere Pritchard's reach might weaken, maybe a rail camp, maybe a larger town, somewhere a judge might at least pretend to care, somewhere the word law wouldn't sound like a joke. But Pritchard's men found their trail anyway. So there they were at sunrise in that open wash, with the riders demanding water and control, and Sarah trying to turn a robbery into a pause. Now you know why Silvano looked like stone that morning. He wasn't just thirsty, he was cornered by his own past. And you know why Sarah offered coffee. She wasn't being kind, she was being smart. After the riders finally left off, leaving only a hanging cloud of dust, Sarah and Silvano didn't stand there congratulating themselves. Out here, you don't celebrate because you survived 1 minute. You move because the next minute is already hunting you. Sarah said it out loud the moment the last hoofbeat faded. "They're not random." Silvano nodded once. "No, they're Pritchard's men," Sarah said. Silvano's mouth tightened like he didn't want to give the words more life, but he couldn't deny them. Yes. Sarah stared down the wash, the ground twisting ahead like a dead snake. Then we stopped walking like prey. Silvano shot her a look that was half respect, half warning. "You got another plan?" Sarah tapped the side of her skillet with one finger, a small metallic knock that felt loud in the empty land. "I always have a plan. It's just not always a good one." They moved fast and kept low where the land allowed it. By mid-morning, they reached the old intake gate near the cottonwoods, an ugly, rough wooden structure meant to guide river water into the acequia when the season was kind. Now it sat half buried in sand, like time had tried to erase it. Silvano knelt and studied the boards. His hands moved over cracked wood and rusted wire with the calm precision of a man who'd fixed fences and gates all his life. "If we open this," he said, "and the river's got any flow at all, it'll run toward town." Sarah squinted toward the green line of trees. "Does the river have any flow?" Silvano didn't pretend. "Not much," he said, "but a little can save seedlings. A little can prove a point." Sarah nodded. "Then we open it." They worked with the kind of quiet urgency that comes from knowing you don't have time for speeches. Silvano pulled at pegs. Sarah twisted wire until her fingers ached. Sand crumbled from the boards. The gate creaked like it resented being woken. Then they heard it. Not a rush, not a roaring miracle, just a thin, stubborn trickle. Water slid through the gap and began to creep into the dry channel. It caught sunlight and flashed like something precious, something alive. Sarah's eyes stung, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was so small and still mattered so much. Silvano stepped back, breathing out like he'd just witnessed grace. "There," he said, "a gift." Sarah shook her head, eyes still on the trickle. "Not a gift," she answered, "a fight." And she was right, because the West doesn't hand you water without sending someone to claim it. Hooves. Sarah turned and saw riders at the far edge of the cottonwoods, same hard shapes as before, plus more, 5 times. Their horses moved through the shade like wolves through tall grass. The lead rider lifted his hand and pointed. Silvano grabbed Sarah's arm. "Into the trees," he said. They ran under the cottonwoods, feet hitting soft earth. Shade cut the heat for a moment, but it didn't cut the danger. Riders split to circle, hooves careful around roots, dust rising in low, spitty plumes. Sarah's mind went cold and clear. She wasn't a shooter. Silvano had an old pistol with limited rounds. A chase in trees ends when the slower one trips or the faster one decides to stop playing. Then Sarah saw it, up ahead near the river bend, a small camp, a wagon, 2 mules, a cook fire with a man crouched beside it, stirring a pot like he was trying to pretend the world was normal. Rail crew, surveyors, traders, didn't matter. It was a person, a witness, a chance. Sarah and Silvano burst into the clearing, breathing hard, hands visible. The man jumped up, startled, his hand moving toward his pistol, eyes flicking between them like he couldn't decide if he'd just been robbed or rescued. Silvano shouted first, raw and honest, "We're not here to rob you." And behind him, the riders entered the clearing with rifles up, like the whole world belonged to their boss. Now think about that for a second. One quiet camp in the cottonwoods, one man cooking his supper, and suddenly it becomes a courtroom, a battlefield, a decision point. That's the West. It doesn't ask you if you want to be part of the story. It just hands you a role and watches what you do with it. Sarah's hands tightened on her skillet strap. Silvano's shoulders squared. The freighter, because that's what he looked like, a man who hauled goods and trouble for a living, stood between his fire and the rifles. And the air in that clearing went still, heavy with the next choice. Because once you're seen, you can't go back to being invisible.
Sarah and Silvano burst into that cottonwood clearing like they'd been chased out of the world itself. A freight wagon sat under the shade, 2 mules tied off nearby, and a small cook fire cracked and popped like it didn't know it was about to become part of somebody else's mess. The man by the fire, white, middle-aged, sunburnt neck, tired eyes, jumped up so fast his knee knocked the pot stand. His hand went straight toward his pistol, not because he wanted to fight, but because that's what a man does when strangers come running at him in the territory. Silvano threw both hands up. "We're not here to rob you," he shouted, breath ragged. The freighter blinked, trying to decide if that was true. And then the riders came in behind them. 5 of them. White men, dusty coats, rifles up, horses stepping careful over roots like they'd done this kind of hunting before. The lead rider reined in and spoke like he owned the air. "Step aside, friend," he said to the freighter. "This ain't your business." The freighter looked from the riders to Sarah and Silvano. He saw the dust on their clothes, the panic in their breathing, and he saw Sarah's cast iron skillet hanging heavy at her side. Not a decoration, a tool, maybe a weapon. Either way, it told him these weren't tourists. He spit into the dirt like he was buying himself a second to think. "Looks like it is my business now," he said. "Now think about that for a second. One quiet camp under cottonwoods, one pot of stew, one man trying to finish his day. And suddenly it's a courtroom, a trap, a crossroads. The West did that to people all the time, turned a peaceful place into a decision you never asked for. The lead rider's face tightened. "You don't want trouble." The freighter's voice stayed flat. "Trouble found me," he said. Sarah stepped forward, palms open. She didn't move fast. Fast gets you shot. She kept her eyes on the freighter, not the rifles. "Sir," Sarah said, "we opened the intake gate. Water is moving towards San Tomas. These men work for Pritchard. They want to stop it." At the name, the freighter's brow creased. Not fear, exactly, recognition, like he'd heard that name in the kind of conversations happen around rail camps and supply wagons. The lead rider snapped at Sarah, sharp and mean. "Shut your mouth, girl." Sarah didn't look at him. She kept her voice steady. "If you let them take us," she told the freighter, "they'll take your water next time. That's how it works out here. It never stops at one ditch." The lead rider raised his rifle a fraction. Not to aim yet, just to remind everyone what kind of world they were standing in. Silvano brought his old pistol up, but he kept it pointed down. That was the line he was trying to walk. Ready, but not the one starting the shooting. The cook fire bubbled quietly between them, like it didn't care which side won. The freighter's eyes flicked to the pot, then to the wagon, then to the riders. You could see the choice settling into his shoulders. Not a heroic choice, a practical one. The kind you make when you realize a man with a rifle in your camp today will come back for more tomorrow. "I'm a freighter," he said to the riders. "I haul supplies for the rail camps. If you shoot folks at my camp, I'll tell the next Army patrol I see." One of the riders laughed like that was cute. "Army don't care about ditch water." The freighter's eyes went hard. "Army cares about rail supply, and I know men who care about who gets paid." That landed. Not because the riders suddenly grew morals, because they had bosses, and bosses hate delays, paper trails, questions, the kind of attention that turns a simple job into a problem. For a moment, the whole clearing held still. Cottonwood leaves trembled in the heat. One mule stomped and shifted its weight. Dust hung in the air like smoke. Then the lead rider did what men like that do when the kill isn't clean. He compromised. "Fine," he said. "We'll let the cook go." Sarah felt her stomach drop because she knew what came next. "But Silvano comes with us," the rider added. "He's the one wanted." Silvano's face went blank. That old rule of his, "don't attach your heart to anything you can lose," rose right up. He was already preparing to trade himself away, to make it simple. Sarah stepped forward before he could speak. "No," she said. One word, flat, final. The lead rider blinked, irritated. "What?" "You want Silvano, then you take me too," Sarah said, "because I'm the one who opened the gate, and I'm the one who will tell every cook line from here to the rail line what you're doing." The rider sneered. "A cook's gossip don't matter." Sarah nodded once like she'd expected that answer. "Then let us walk." Silvano hissed her name, warning in his voice. Sarah leaned in just enough to speak low so only he could hear. "If he takes you," she whispered, "you die, and I'm tired of men deciding who dies because it's convenient." Silvano stared at her like she'd slapped him awake. The freighter shifted, one hand near his holster, eyes narrow. He didn't draw, he just stood ready to become part of the problem if the riders pushed it. The lead rider looked between them, weighing the cost. And that's the thing about bullies. Sometimes they don't back down because they're kind. They back down because the math changes. Finally, he lifted his chin. "Get out," he said. "Both of you. But hear this. Pritchard will not stop." Silvano's shoulders sagged, relief and shame mixing together in one tired exhale. Sarah met the rider's eyes. "Neither will we," she said. The riders turned their horses and rode off through the trees, dust rising in low sheets between cottonwood trunks. The sound of horses faded, and only then did the clearing feel like it could breathe again. The freighter let out a long breath. "You folks are trouble," he said. Silvano gave a tired little smile. "Yes." The freighter looked at Sarah's skillet. "Are you really a cook?" Sarah nodded. "Yes." He jerked his head toward the pot. "Then earn your space," he said. "Put something in that makes it worth the risk I just took." Sarah didn't argue. She walked to the fire, knelt, and pulled out her deerskin pouch. She opened it and pinched a little of that dried, stubborn memory between her fingers. When it hit the pot, the smell changed. Warm, sharp, alive, like a door opening. The freighter's eyes widened just a fraction. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." Sarah stirred slow, steady. "You saved us," she said. The freighter shrugged, practical as dirt.
"I saved my camp," he replied. "You were just in it. And that's the West right there. Even kindness wears a work shirt."
They stayed in that freighter's camp until the sun started slipping toward the edge of the world. And I don't mean they relaxed. Nobody relaxes when they've just watched rifles decide to let it go instead of make it easy. They stayed because sometimes the smartest thing you can do in the West is stop moving for a few hours and let the dust settle somewhere else. Silvano sat quiet near the wagon shade, shoulders rounded like the weight of his own name was pressing down on him. Sarah stayed by the cook fire, stirring the pot and listening while the freighter talked. He talked the way working men talk when they've been alone too long, half for company, half to prove they're still real. He told him about rail camps up north, about supply runs that paid steady if you didn't ask questions and didn't get sentimental. He said those camps didn't care who you'd been yesterday, they cared what you could do today. And Sarah listened to that like it was a map drawn in smoke. Not a perfect map, but a direction. When the light turned orange and the cottonwoods started throwing long shadows across the ground, Silvano finally pushed himself up like his joints had to argue first. "We should move," he said. And Sarah didn't argue, she just asked the question that had been sitting in her throat all afternoon. "What about San Terras?" Silvano looked toward the river bend through the trees. You could see the faint glimmer of water out there, thin and stubborn, running where it had been blocked. He didn't pretend it was victory. "The gate is open," he said. "That's something." Sarah's mouth tightened. "It's not enough." Silvano met her eyes. "No," he said, "but it's what two tired people could do." Now think about that for a second. That's the kind of truth the West forces on you. Not the pretty kind, the practical kind. You don't always get to fix the whole problem. Sometimes all you can do is wedge a door open and hope the people behind you notice the light. Before they left, the freighter made it clear he wasn't giving charity. He traded like all men out there eventually do. He handed Sarah a small sack of flour, coarse burlap, light enough to carry, heavy enough to matter, and he took a portion of her cooking as payment. And he didn't smile when he did it either, just nodded like the deal was finished, and that was that. They walked north under the first stars, staying off the main trail. The world was cooling down, but not forgiving. A night in that country could freeze your sweat into grit, and the wind never stopped trying to peel you open. Sarah didn't know what would happen back in San Tomas. She didn't know if the water would keep running. She didn't know if Pritchard would punish the town for the insult to being challenged in public. She didn't know if anyone in a courthouse would ever care about a ledger that had burned into ash. But she had learned something in that clearing. She had seen armed men hesitate when another man with a stake in the moment stood watching. She had seen the way witnesses could change the math, even when the law didn't show up. And she had seen how food, something as simple as a pot over a fire, could turn strangers into people who suddenly didn't want blood on their own ground. Silvano walked beside her, quieter than he'd been before, not because he was scared of the dark, because he was thinking. After a long stretch of silent walking, he spoke. "I thought I was done choosing," he said. Sarah kept her eyes on the path. "You're alive," she answered, "so you're still choosing." Silvano let out a breath that could have been a laugh if it had a little more warmth in it. "You talk like a preacher." Sarah's voice came dry, almost amused. "Preachers don't carry skillets." They kept moving until the night got deep enough that even the stars felt sharp. Then they found a place to hide a fire, rocks close together, a shallow dip in the ground, just enough shelter to keep the flame low and the smoke thin. Sarah struck a match like it mattered, because it did. The fire caught small. She poured a little water into her cast iron skillet and started working flour into dough with the kind of quiet focus that tells you this is more than cooking. It's control. It's one thing in a world of chaos that still obeys your hands. She pressed the dough flat and laid it into the hot iron. It sizzled softly, and that smell rose up. Plain, warm, real. Not fancy, not a feast, but it was something that didn't taste like fear. Silvano ate slowly, like every bite was a memory he wasn't sure he deserved. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to.
Out there, words were expensive. You only spent 'em when they bought you something. Sarah sat with the spice pouch near her lap, fingers brushing at once, absent-minded and protective at the same time. The firelight flickered across her face, and you could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but you could also see something else. She wasn't just surviving now, she was steering. And Silvano, man of rules, man of distance, was starting to realize his rule about not attaching your heart wasn't a shield forever. Sometimes it was a cage. The fire burned down into coals. The wind rose and pushed a few sparks into the dark. And for a while they just listened to the night, the faint rustle of brush, the slow creak of leather as they shifted, the quiet sound of two people who didn't know what tomorrow would demand, but knew they'd meet it on their feet. Because in the West, that's what hope often looks like. Not a speech, just a fire that stays lit.
I'll tell you what I've learned, sitting here with you by this little fire, listening to the wind scrape over the sand like it's trying to erase the world. Freedom in the Old West was real, sure, but it was never free. It cost water. It cost sleep. It cost the comforting lie that the world has to be fair just because you're trying your best. San Tomas didn't get saved in some clean, satisfying way. There wasn't a final showdown where the bad man learned a lesson and rode off a better person. Men like Pritchard don't usually change. They adapt. They shift their weight. They look for an easier angle. But weeks after Sarah Leighton and Don Silvano vanished into the open country, travelers started talking. You know how it goes out here. News doesn't arrive in newspapers. It arrives in dust on a stranger's boots, in a tired man's voice across a trading counter, in a rumor that keeps repeating because people want it to be true. They said the acequia in San Tomas was running again. Not roaring, not overflowing, just moving. Thin, steady, stubborn. The kind of water that doesn't look like much until you remember what it means to see cracked mud turn dark again, to see a ditch that was dead start carrying a pulse. They said the town started posting watchers near the intake gate, not young boys playing soldier, men with old rifles and tired eyes who didn't want to use them but didn't want to be surprised either. They stood out there in the heat and the wind, watching the north road like it might bring salvation or sickness, probably both. And they said Pritchard's riders showed up less often, not because Pritchard suddenly grew a conscience, because pressure shifts. Maybe rail business pulled attention. Maybe another neighbor pushed back harder. Maybe Pritchard decided he could win later by waiting, the way he always liked to do. Now think about that for a second. Sometimes victory in the West wasn't a parade. Sometimes it was just getting the next morning, getting the next week, holding your ground long enough that the other man had to choose a different target. Then there was the other part of the talk, the part people told softer, like they weren't sure if it was real or if they were just hungry for a story. They said a woman with a black skillet came back to San Tomas sometimes, not in daylight, at night, quiet as a shadow along the ditch bank. No speeches, no banners, no "remember me," just a small fire tucked low where the reeds could hide the smoke and a pot that smelled like something the desert couldn't kill. They said she cooked for the ditch cleaners, the men who did the unglamorous work, shoveling silt, repairing banks, keeping the water moving where it belonged. Men whose hands were cracked and swollen, whose backs hurt in a way that never fully healed. They'd sit around that little flame and eat from tin cups while the water slid past in the dark. And for a few minutes, the West would stop feeling like a place designed to break you. Maybe it was Sarah. Maybe it wasn't. But the rumor stuck because it made sense. That's what she did. She fed the part of people that wanted to stay human. And if you're wondering what happened to Sarah and Silvano after all that, after the chapel yard went to chaos, after riders hunted them down a dry wash, after they pried open a wooden gate just to make a thin ribbon of water move again, well, this is the part where the trail fades. They kept walking. Not because they believed the world would reward them, it rarely does. They walked because stopping meant letting other men write the ending. And Sarah had already learned something important. The West doesn't care what you deserve. It only cares what you can carry, what you can do, and how long you can keep moving. Silvano walked too, and I like to think he carried something different after San Tomas. Not hope, exactly. Hope can be fragile out here, but maybe he carried a little less distance, a little less of that rule he lived by, the one that said you don't attach your heart to anything you can lose overnight.
Because the truth is, you can lose anything overnight anyway. The trick is deciding what's worth risking. You and I both know the land doesn't hand out mercy. The wind doesn't negotiate. The sun doesn't care if you're good. But people sometimes hesitate. Sometimes they stand up when they should fold. Sometimes they let a stranger warm their hands by the fire instead of reaching for a gun. And sometimes a pot of beans with the right spice in it does more than fill a belly. It makes witnesses. It makes neighbors. It makes the next cruelty harder to hide. That's not a lesson. It's just an observation from a man who's watched too many roads and too many endings. This is Savage West Stories. Stay sharp out there.